So great. Thank you very much. It's good to have everyone back. And it's good to see people connecting and networking. And I just had a quick chat to Greg, and one of the things he was saying, and he's going to talk towards the end of the session, one of the things he was saying is he put out an email to people and asked them some questions about standards and was really surprised at how many people are interested and keen to be part of it and felt, I think, supported were his words, and to be part of a community. So it's good to see that community growing, and it's good to see you building the relationships that make that community work. And as I was saying, for people like me, this community is critical. And you being able to interact, integrate, get together is really important as part of our work. But it's also important that I know that I can come across to you and ask questions and get the information I need. And I think that's one of the really valuable parts about building a community, because you don't build an individual person's information, you build a collective of information, which is great to see. And I really appreciate that you're all working on that. Now, we come to the part of the session which is a little bit more open, gives us a chance to engage a little bit with some conversation around some of these subjects. Again, please bear with us as we try to navigate and organise the technology. I think it's going to work really well. Chris and Jason are doing a brilliant job. I think we're going to have some questions as we have the panel session coming across from Zoom, and I'll try and figure out, or we'll try and figure out together how we'll manage some questions from the floor and questions from Zoom. What I might ask is, if you have a question, I'm going to do that school thing. I'm really sorry. It would be good if you raised your hand. I apologise if we can't get around everyone, but I'm hoping that there will be a chance to pick up some of those questions in the feedback afterwards. So we'll hold on to them and try and either run them through future sessions or run them back past people so that everyone gets a chance to have the questions here. We'll certainly be collecting them all. We're going to collect all the ones off soon. But if you have a question or you want to make a statement, and I'm open to small snippets of evangelization which may not come in the form of questions, so but please keep them short. I think it's really important that we get a chance to show our passion. If you do want to roll in the question there, that's great. But if you've just got something to say because you think it's important, please feel free to do some of that, but in a way that keeps things rolling and it's not too long. So thank you. Now, I'll introduce the panel we have today. We're very lucky, these 4 people and 2 people online to join us. We have Shulk from, Zeeman Vandermeer from ACC, and you're in charge of standards in ACC. And
yeah, so I'm basically involved in ACC and looking after standards. I sort of have a general sort of responsibility for information strategy, as it were. I also sit with Alistair on the HISA committee. So I have this conflict that at one hand, I sit and look after the sector from a standards point of view, and then I've got to go back to ACC and go and implement standards at ACC. And a large part of the challenge that we actually have is that, so Scott was basically talking earlier on about he had specific problems that he's trying to solve with standards. In the case of when you start looking at HISA, we're actually trying to define standards which will help the sector. And our big problem is how do we convince the sector to actually implement those things? So I have that challenge when I go back to ACC in terms of how do we actually implement this stuff and actually make it work.
Brilliant. Thanks, Zeeman. I think it's a challenge that lots of us are dealing with, so that's brilliant. Thank you. Shulk is back with us to be part of the panel, and he's already brought his presentation and some of the information, so it's great to have you as part of this discussion as well. And then we have Carmen. Carmen, you're the National Manager for Standards New Zealand.
Yes, and I just wanted to say what a great event this is, and Standards New Zealand is really, really pleased to be partnering together with DIA and Statistics New Zealand to be leading this community of practice, and I'm really pleased and privileged to be part of this panel today. I just wanted to apologize for missing the first part of the discussion today. I was actually having some really interesting discussions with our American standards development counterparts, and I hope to be able to inject some of the international sort of flavor in some of the discussion today. So really pleased to be here today. Thank you, Graham.
It's great to have you as part of the panel. So thank you. And then, of course, we have Byron as well. Byron Cochrane is the Managing Director of Geospatial Architect and Open Work Limited.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, that's a company founded after previous role with in the geospatial office at Lens. So a long background in working in standards, largely in the geospatial realm, and working with a number of standards communities around the world and a number of contexts, local government, private industry, defense, and national government as well. moving into private industry, we really emphasize standards, open standards as part of our work, not knowing if that would be a good business move, but it's actually turned out that that has been the primary reason people hire us, is to help them through their standards issues and to be more interoperable with other people they need to share data with.
Brilliant, and it's quite neat to hear a bit of an international theme coming through our work, because even though our borders are a little bit closed, we are part of an international community, and the standards we need are the things that allow us to share globally as well as locally. So the first question we have is why have standards, especially data and...
We've got two panelists.
Oh, sorry, of course. Well. Oh, hey, my apologies. I told you it's good that I've got a team to keep me on track. Patricia is coming in as part of the panel as well, and so is Barbara. Patricia, you've done a lot in terms of an advocate for people using standards and part of the standards network.
Yes, and I have got quite a lot to say about this. The whole process that you're talking about is to be person-centered. The end user, the consumer, is a critical part of this, and the end user is very largely ignored. How to put consumers into your process needs a strategy, a complete strategy that looks at how do you identify the right people? What are they there for? Do they need training? Where are they going to meet? Do you cover travel costs? Have they got remote access to meet you? What do you want them there for? What input, what knowledge, what experience, and when in your program do you need this input? And the really delicate question, I think I'm the only person around this place except for Barbara, who is a long-standing consumer representative, who gives the time away rather than gets paid for it. You want good consumers? You need to think about the cost.
Thank you, Patricia. It's great to have you here, and that consumer perspective is so important, and thank you for bringing us back to that, because it is what we're here for to a degree. We are here to serve, and being reminded who we serve and having the people we serve feedback into our model is critical. And Barbara, that's a little bit of your experience as well, as I understand. I think you were going to be more observer in this, but it's great to have you here, and please participate as much as you feel the need. You've come from a little bit of a health background.
Yes, my experience is in health standards, and I have been involved with the work of HISO some years ago, and I guess some of my special work has been around the National Health Index and the standards around that. I thoroughly endorse Pat's comments. The voluntary input from consumer reps should not be underestimated. We have contributed a lot over the years, and we are keen to be able to contribute and see the value of our work. But a voluntary input is a big ask when some of the standards work is so detailed and time consuming.
Thank you, Barbara. I think it's going to be a good, robust discussion, which is what we need. So thank you, the people online and the people here. Look, I will go to the first question. And this is probably a question that I might get you, Carmen, to lead, and perhaps, Emin, I think you may have something that you want to throw in here as well. Why have standards, especially data and digital standards? Well, what's the purpose? How do they make a difference?
So thank you for that very big question, Grant, and for having me lead off on it. You know, it's so pleasing and a real pleasure to be in a room full of people in a community which I think already have some basic understanding of standards and why they're important. So I'll just talk about the perspective of the National Standards Body, which is Standards New Zealand, and why we think standards are important and why we need to have them. So I always see standards as forming part of a system. You know, there's the wider quality infrastructure system that standards are part of. And we need to recognize that standards are part of a system covering things like accreditation and conformance. So we need to be operating within that wider quality infrastructure that is really soft infrastructure that underpins many parts of our lives. And many people don't see standards. If you ask the average person in the street, they don't see standards and they don't necessarily understand what standards are. But standards really underpin a lot of the things that happen in our daily lives. And we don't think about them until something happens. And usually it's not something that's great. When they don't work well, or when the market is expected to meet or comply with a standard and it doesn't work, that's when people become really aware of the importance of standards. So I see standards as that soft infrastructure that underpins a big part of our lives. They are invisible, but they are critical. And I think that it's really, really important for people who understand the value of standards and who are working behind the scenes to develop standards, to use them, to really be selling that message to, it might be ministers, it might be the public, whoever it might be, that standards are really important and critical. And we need to think about how we invest in them and how we work together as a community to promote them. Because to the wider community, they don't really think about standards until something happens. And usually that something is a negative thing, you know, a product doesn't meet a particular safety standard or a counter doesn't meet a standard, then there is an issue. So to me, two words spring to mind when we talk about standards, and this is what I see is the value that we derive from standards in particular data and digital standards. The first is confidence. So standards essentially to me allow our companies, our exporters, our importers, our users and consumers to transact with confidence. When they see that a product meets a particular standard, they have some confidence that that product actually meets a particular, could be a safety threshold, could be a quality benchmark. But where does this confidence come from? And a lot of that confidence, at least from the national standards body's perspective, comes from the way in which standards are developed, at least in our world where we look at consensus-based standards. We use an internationally recognized approach, and we run a process to develop standards that's independent from what any particular party might want to see reflected in a standard. So keystones of this process are, for example, using technical experts. So Standards New Zealand are not experts, but we use technical experts which represent a wide and balanced range of stakeholder interests. We use consensus decision-making, and we publicly consult on all draft standards. So what this means is that when a standard gets approved and published at the end of that process, we can have a high level of confidence, and the market can have a high level of confidence that the standard has been developed using the right expertise and knowledge from the community. The public has had the opportunity to provide feedback, and the content is the buy-in of key stakeholders who will then go on to use the standard, and they are the ones who will be impacted, and that includes users and consumers. So it is this process that we use, which generates confidence in the marketplace when someone uses a standard. And the second word is interoperability. I think that word has probably been used quite a few times today. Now, I'm not an expert at all on data and digital standards, but I do know that they are critical for allowing interoperability between systems and devices. And without common standards that we can all have confidence in, we have real issues. You know, our systems won't be able to talk to each other, our devices won't be able to talk to each other. And from an international point of view, I think that's really important. You know, New Zealand is a key part of lots of supply chains. So we work with a lot of international partners in the area of trade and investment. And I think looking international first at what international standards are being developed and making sure that New Zealand is shaping and influencing those standards is a key part of making sure that interoperability is actually worldwide. It's not just domestic, and it's also a fantastic opportunity to actually build on the expertise of its global expertise that we want to leverage. So I'll just leave it there, Grant, because I'm conscious of time, and really happy to have a discussion with my fellow panelists here.
Brilliant, Carmen. And I think you've opened up lots of discussion points that I think we'll pick up as threads over the next little while. So thank you very much. Zeeman, and just your reflection on that. Why do we have standards? Why are they important?
Yeah, I think the important thing about standards is that quite often we can just carry on talking about standards for a long time. But actually, at the end of the day, it's actually what are the problems that we're trying to solve by using standards. And quite often we lose track of some of those things. So in healthcare, patient safety is a key concern in terms of information sharing and how we actually do that. And so that integration is actually quite important. But I think that there's a maturity sort of curve that we're actually working through at the moment. So integration is really a key aspect of everything that we do these days. Organizations can't just integrate with themselves. They've actually got to talk to the outside world. But I think in government, one of our challenges is how do we start operating as a government or providing services from a government point of view, as opposed to each individual agency. And that is a very different. Lots of countries actually have a website which you go to, and it basically represents the government, and you can then go to use each of the services, not necessarily dealing with a particular agency at all, but just a service that's basically provided to you and how you integrate that. And all of these things require standards, because you can't have that or implement something like that without having a framework. So for me, a lot of it actually depends on this for integration and digital kind of deployment. Depends on what are those strategies that you're trying to underpin, how are you going to do that, and then what are the standards that you actually need that enable you to actually implement that. And so it's a sort of architectural approach to how you actually need to do things. I think another important part that we need to think about quite a lot in the standard space, and this comes back to, you can either talk about the technology or you can translate it into business terms. Quite often when you talk to people about standards, you tend to lose them. Not everybody is passionate about standards. We just have a bunch of freaky people sitting in this room who are interested in standards. But you have to understand that there are people out there who have no understanding, no real interest in what you're actually talking about. What they're really interested in is what are you going to achieve by implementing this standard? And so you need to be able to translate it into business terms to sell the benefits of what you are actually trying to do and focus less on the standards. Some of us have to deal with the technical stuff to be able to make that work at the end of the day. But getting that message across so people understand what you're actually trying to achieve and where you're trying to work towards, that's really the key to achieving success at the end of the day. Adoption of standards is very, very difficult. In New Zealand, we have an approach where we're very consultative in the way that we actually work in implementing standards. I come like Scott from South Africa, where things are very autocratic. And I can tell you that we sort of implemented standards there where we basically said, we're going to implement ICD-10. And the 1st of October 2005, we will implement ICD-10. And if you don't use ICD-10 when you submit a claim to somebody to pay it, and you don't have that ICD-10 code, you're not going to get paid. So you have a lever in terms of how you implement those things. So here we've got to try and, convince people this is a good idea. What are we trying to achieve? And actually make sure they understand the real benefits of what you're trying to do.
Thank you, Zeeman. And it's good to hear you talk about that integration stuff. It's a good plug, but it's also, I think, really important for people like me to understand all of this so that we can get out and help you evangelize it. But it's really important also to have the specialists to be able to put some backbone into what we're doing. Was there any other comments that from anyone else around the Byron? Byron, what I might do though, as you say that, I apologise. I'm just going to bring this a little bit closer.
All right.
And I might get you to pass it around if that's all right, just as we speak.
Okay. Yeah, I tend to think of standards as a language, particularly digital standards. They provide the grammar, the syntax, the semantics of a language between communities that need to share information. And when you think about it that way, you end up with a guidance on how to address your standard. You have a community here who wants to share data with another community. Let's make sure we can speak the same language. And if you can do that, you can share the standards. But it also is an encoding of those rules so that others outside that domain, should they want to use the same resources, know how to do so.
Yes, I'd like to take the opportunity to talk about the contact tracing standard in this way. A standard is a document, and as a document, it needs to be as polished as it can be. The contact tracing was a wonderful project, but the outcome in terms of a document has got some nasty flaws in it. In the first line, it talks about deleting everything up to and including the colon. And later on in the words, you find this colon is transmuted into a semicolon, which is going to cause confusion when this is used. The document itself can't make up its mind whether it's a standard or a specification. And it's got some nasty grammatical errors in it that need fixing. A document matters. It matters how you say it, and it matters that it's properly done and put right when it isn't properly done.
Thank you, Patricia. And I think that's very much the balance we're holding here, isn't it? The ability to do something and the need to do something, along with the importance of maintaining the, well, I was going to say the standards, but maintaining the detail as you go. Very good. I'll move on to the next question. And I think it follows on a little bit from what you were saying, Zeman, around how we implement some of this. How can agencies and industries and others use regulation, policy, and legislation to help support the process of getting standards used in the right way? And I might hand that one to you as well, Carmen, if you wanted to lead us off in there.
I'm just going to move the mic. Thank you, Grant. I just wanted to use this opportunity to leverage off what Zeman said around how can standards solve problems. You know, what problems are we trying to solve with standards, and what can we achieve with standards? And to me, I really like the way that he has framed that up, and the question here about how data and digital standards can support regulations, policies, and legislation. So I think the key word here is support. To me, standards are a tool that you can use to solve problems. They are not always the right tool, depending on what the problem is. And even if we can be sure that standards are the right tool, there are different kinds of standards. There are consensus-based standards that I've talked about. I'm sure that there are private standards that are developed in different ways. And I think the key here is actually making sure that we have got the right tool to solve the problem that we are trying to solve. And so the important thing here, I think, is that how do we make sure that data and digital standards can support regulations, policies, and legislation is, you know, there need to be really strong partnerships between government, industry, users, and standards developers, so that we actually have good communications, good collaboration, and good information sharing on how we can use standards to solve those problems, you know. And I think that's easily said, you know, the word partnership is easily used by me, but to have true partnerships means that we need to invest in long-term relationships. You know, we need to have commitment, and we need to have the right forums for that to happen, because I do believe that it's through ongoing conversations between all the key players involved that we can make sure that when we develop standards, they are the right standards to solve the problem that regulation is trying to solve, you know, that the right standards are being developed, the right, how we can have conversations about how they are used. So to me, it's kind of a broader, bigger issue about how do we continue to keep this kind of community of practice going and have those relationships and partnerships that enable those conversations to be had.
And I guess for someone like me, the question would be, what comes first, the standard or the regulation, or is there a particular process for that? How do we define each of those playing together?
I mean, to me, there isn't a right or wrong answer there. I think from my experience, often standards could come about because industry believe that a standard should be developed, and then a regulator could come along and say, oh, okay, I'm trying to solve this problem, but there's already a standard out there that I can use, you know, and I can pick up that standard and cite it in regulations. You could have it the other way around as well, whereby a regulator is wanting to regulate for a particular objective, and they're looking for different tools in the toolbox to help them. And they say, and they might come to the national standards body to say, actually, a standard might be the right tool, and I can talk to you about developing a standard. So I think it could happen in both instances, and they both have their own sort of merits. That's my view anyway, Grant.
Thank you, Carmen.
The problem with that is that standards are developed, and for instance, there is one on accessibility for people who are visually impaired. The standard's there, but it's not mandatory. Nobody is in charge. Nobody makes sure that it is actually implemented when standards are made public. And the gap between regulation and standards is sometimes unbridgeable.
Thanks, Patricia. And I wonder whether that talks a little bit to what Zeman mentioned, and Schultz, you may have some experience with this idea that actually you can make some things a little bit more mandatory, or put a little bit more force behind some of the standards. Is that?
For me as an end user, I think also listening to Patricia, where she was saying we need to keep the end user in mind, and being the evangelist for really the end user and the digital standards, it's really challenging to fulfill that kind of role. So at the end of the day, for me specifically, it is, what are you trying to achieve? What do you want this person to do with this piece of documentation? What do you want? What is a physical action that you want to achieve in the end of the day? And that has been the challenge. That's really been the journey that we need to go through, is having that end user mindset, trying to think about the physical action, or what are we trying to achieve? This system needs to talk to that system, right? Most efficiently, easily. So it's really the end product. And for me, like Patricia said there, it's who's going to lead that? Who's going to fill that role? Who's going to get educated? Who's going to run that? As you've seen from my presentation, it's the guys on the ground, dare I say in the trenches. We need support. At the moment, I just go through the legislations, I read through it, what can I do? And then I sit there with this massive amount that we need to achieve. And there's no way one or two people can do that. So that's why I use standards.
And I guess that leads a little bit into one of the questions I saw come from the folk on Zoom of how can standards be evaluated for their effectiveness. So if we have these mechanisms for implementing them and for perhaps enforcing them, if we go to certain bodies, how do we then evaluate that this is an effective approach? And I guess that includes, Patricia, the feedback from consumers to say it's working for them.
Well, the ISO have produced a suite of standards on consumer satisfaction. Use the existing knowledge. The ISO also has a consumer policy committee, COPOLCO, which has got training programs for including consumers in the process. We've signed up as a government to the Open Government Agreement, International Open Data Charter. The Data Futures Forum a while back produced some beautiful work on what data, how to handle it in this new shiny world we're heading into. We're not using existing stuff at all well. There's a report here that Barbara was involved in. It's engaging consumers in health. It's there. This stuff exists, but we don't move from principles to action at all well.
So the implementation and delivery of this and seeing the standards working on the ground is critical?
Absolutely. And you've got to involve consumers at both ends, both in the making and in the using.
And it sounds like, so consumers are one of those natural feedback loops. Are there others within the work that we do that shows a feedback on whether a standard is working?
Everybody else has got a financial interest in it.
It certainly depends on where your community of interest, who is using the standards. Many of the standards that I'm involved in are quite narrow users. For instance, working on a bit of work on
submission of digital plats for surveyors. The surveyor community and the government agency, those are the two players. That's really about it. And the software vendors then that have to comply to it. So that's the community you have to really look at. But it all depends on the standards that you're working with. And again, it's problem oriented, like was mentioned earlier. If you have a problem, you have a community that's facing that problem, and those are the stakeholders that should be involved.
Brilliant, and again, creating that feedback loop in some mechanism.
I mean, I think that the whole around standards is really about the processes involved around it and how you actually manage that. So when you put out a standard, it's actually the context within which you're using it and actually giving some drive in terms of how you actually do that. I think the other notion, which is quite strong in standards, is that people tend to view them as being cast in concrete. And I think that's one of the big problems we face, because the world is changing all the time, and having dynamic standards is actually more what it's about going forward. You can't have something which is fairly static. And I mean, we've had some discussions with stats around some of the ways that we use some of the occupations and things like that in terms of standards. And every agency is different, and every agency has a different interpretation of how those things actually get used. So you can't have a one size fits all kind of approach to solving some of these problems. You've actually got to say, here's a framework, here's some basics that you have to put in place, but tailor it to what you actually need to do and support dynamic sort of reconfiguration of some of that information. And I think that agility that we need to build, because I think one of the big problems we have in government is that we're not agile enough. You know, it takes forever to do things and all the rest of it. And how do we get some of that agility and some of the freedom back into what we actually need to do? At the end of the day, we're here to solve business problems. We're trying to provide a better service to the people of New Zealand, the people who use those interfaces or standards that we actually define. And so you need to be aware that these things change, and you know, they need some support. The support behind this is actually quite important. Quite often we just put out standards and says, good luck guys, off you go and use it, as opposed to, you know, how do we actually support you to make use of it? Do you understand what it's about, the context? I mean, the presentation that Alistair did, I mean, you know, the codes are one thing, but actually the context within which it's used and how it's actually deployed, that's really critical to the success of how you actually make use of those standards.
Thank you, Stephen. I can see a couple of questions from the floor. I'm just going to try and use this a bit like a microphone. If I could hand that over to you and you could ask your question, that would be great, and then I'll just take it back.
Hello, I'm Andrew Eccleston. I'm a senior associate at the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University. And through a variety of work practices, both in civil society and in government, I've been involved in open government partnership commitments to deliver certain projects. And I'm impressed that by Patricia's input into this, both in terms of how does government actually compensate people for giving up their time to provide input into this, because there's been a lot of recognition in the discussion about the value of understanding the end consumer's viewpoint and what they need in terms of having an effective service. All of government digital service design standards say work in the open and understand your users. But one of the key obstacles, I think, to this is also being clear that there's a funding obstacle, not just in terms of participation, but in terms of access to the standards themselves. Because the funding model for work to develop standards requires that those standards be sold, and agencies have the resources, obviously, to buy them. But if you're asking for a level playing field with consumers in terms of their input into designing services, there's obviously copyright and charging model issues around that. And I think one of the things that the government needs to think about is, and I would welcome, obviously, views from this discussion about how do we really effectively enable people's participation in the making and administration of laws and policies, which has been in the OIA since 1982, if the consumer side of this can't get access to the standards that are underpinning these service design decisions.
Thank you for that. It's why I started off by saying there needs to be a strategy around consumer input.
I'd like to address some parts of that question. So one of the issues, you know, ISO is a big standards organization that charges for access to standards, and it is an issue. But it's not one that's really solved by making the standards free, because those normative standards documents, only the experts really want to read them. They're thick, they're really hard to make use of. You give those out to the consumers and they're just gonna, they'll fall asleep before they get to page 3 or 4. But I think the solution to that, what I found in some our work, is that you don't think of documentation as a single thing. There's models for documentation that includes for technical documentation that splits it up into kind of cookbooks, into tutorials, reference documents, and kind of general guidance that what goes behind it. And those sorts of documents can be made freely available and should be. And often they'll reveal essentially an approach to the standard that suits the community that's trying to use them, rather than, a particular community that's trying to use them, rather than a general approach that would be in that normative document. So rethinking of what the standards documents are needed for people to understand how to actually use the standards, whether it's a cookbook or a tutorial or a normative document, or kind of an encyclopedic sort of approach. Those kind of 4 different categories are a really useful way of thinking about how to make the standards more accessible to the right audiences.
Thanks, Byron. A good conversation there around democratization and access to standards. I'm going to take one question from over here. I know this gentleman's had his hand up for a minute.
Thank you. Kia ora, Sam Keith from Ministry of Social Development. I'm a senior GIS analyst there. I was really struck by something you were saying earlier around damn, now it's come out of my head. Around the flexibility of implementation of the standards and how you could take some of the core truths of it, then be a bit gentle about how you're actually implementing it. And I was wondering how you've resolved the tension between allowing for that flexibility, but also keeping the integration point. That's also an incredibly valuable point. Do you want to kind of expand on how you might resolve that tension?
So I mean, one of the approaches that, sorry, I'll wait for the mic to arrive. So one of the approaches around this that Stats was sort of promoting was basically they have a product called ARIA, which basically all the standards are published. And essentially they can be augmented and you can add additional things that you need to do. So it's a case of how do you flex around some of those things. So I think a lot of standards tend to be too prescriptive around everything that needs to be done, as opposed to having a core, which is sort of like a minimum standard. So you have some commonality, but then sort of add the modifications that you actually need to suit your own specific purposes. I mean, one of the things I didn't realize, for instance, with occupations is that in ACC, we're just interested in what the occupations are. But some people are interested in the level of skill that you actually need for some particular occupations. And that's a very different kind of use of occupations to what traditionally ACC has. And so that's the kind of augmentation that I actually think is actually necessary around some of the standards and making them applicable within a specific context. So you can have a standard which basically says, here's all of the standard occupations that we actually believe in, but actually that connected information is actually what the real value is actually about at the end of the day. And so how you actually start supporting that kind of capability and allowing that to actually happen and sort of almost, creating some additional standards kind of documentation around that so people are aware of some of these uses. Because quite often, I mean, we talk about standards, but it's actually about the application and the context within which you use it that's actually quite important. So understanding, what the level of skill is that's attached to an occupation is very important to some people. Other people just don't care. So, use it in the context in which it actually, makes sense for you as an organization.
We work especially with us as a smaller consumer base. There I say it's a bit of a modular approach where you don't have the teams, you can't deliver this, you can't go through the end product that's envisioned. That's what, like I said in my journey, we really try to understand first what is it trying to achieve and then build on from there, add on as you get more resource, as you get more buy-in, just a continuous improvement journey, but keep your basis right.
This is a really good question, actually, and a struggle point where a lot of standards fall over. If they're too rigid, they fall over because people don't really follow them properly. And and you get things like, oh, we use that field for something else for some business reason that makes a thing just not really adhere to the standard at all, but they do it for very good business reasons. One of the solutions that come to in several circumstances is in the guidance document about governance of the standards, governance of use of the standards more than the development of the standards actually. So for instance, in a metadata standard guidance doing for Australia and New Zealand, we have a section in there that says who decides how these fields should be populated. So like something about putting an ID for the record in there. Well, yeah, you got to do that. That's top level guidance. That shouldn't be varied by anyone. But if you have something like contact information, do you put the name of the individual or the name of the role? Do you put their phone number as well as their email address? Decisions like that are actually governed at the very low level, at the agency level. Keywords are another one. Like those are usually a domain decision. You know, marine science is going to have a different set of keywords that they want to use as for describing their documents than say some business need, you know, and they'll use terms, maybe same terms in different ways, but they have to have their own deciding on what that happens. And that happens at the domain level. So guidance documents on using a standard that say what level that these decisions are made on whether you, on how you populate these fields are extremely useful to making the standard really implementable and long-lived.
And ideally effective.
And effective, yes, far more effective.
Now, in the interest of time, I realize I've got a few questions that were on the sheet. I do want to touch base with Byron and with Patricia, because two of these questions relate particularly to you. One of them is the open industry data and digital standards support the private, or can open digital and data standards support the private and public sector? And if we could have your comments on that, Byron.
Yeah, that's a big question, because the private sector spans from Google all the way down to the little two-man shop working in some small town in New Zealand. And the answer to that varies tremendously by where you're at. So mandating standards, one of the huge problems that often have is like a council will have a particular software system they're using, and the use of standards is often mandated by the ability of that software to support that standard. Getting standards into that software is a huge problem. The incentives for a big company to support a standard is somewhat perverse, really, because a big company is going to say, well, we really would rather have vendor lock-in. So maybe we'll implement the standards, but we'll do it in our own way, so it's not really useful to others. And so we can get, you know, monopoly share. Once they get monopoly share, they stop having to listen to the customer. That's the problem with monopolies historically, and just charge a high rent for the use of their tools. So there's that end that it's really hard to get that in, and we face that on the international level on several standards efforts. From a smaller business level, it's kind of the opposite. You know, if you're trying to open up a business and implement a standard and provide a service, relying on open standards can be a really leg up to getting your business going. Trying to have a, you know, copyright this thing that says I'm going to do it this way and no one else can unless you use my software and pay me for it is counterproductive to gain a small business off the ground. So you have kind of that whole range of things. The other issue that comes up again here too is governance of the standard. When you go out and you say, hey, we've decided that everyone's going to use this standard, the company is going to look at the risk profile there. They're going to say, how much is it going to cost me to support this standard? And what's the risk that this standard will disappear in 5 years? So it's really, really important that commitments are made for the governance of those standards to go forward, that they will be well governed, and that the players who are trying to implement these things have those feedback loops to feed back into the system, so the next review cycle that happens, that those comments can be incorporated in and issues can be resolved. So the whole governance process is really critical to having effective standards. Without a solid governance cycle on the standards, in my opinion, don't really have a standard at all.
Thanks, Byron. I suspect that that's a future conversation, the governance of standards. I might, Patricia, just in the last couple of minutes, I might just come back to you and a voice from the consumer. How do we get consumers at the heart of our digital and data standards, and how do we get them involved?
Unmute. No, unmute.
Oh,
Patricia, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
I'm unmuted now, as it's $1 million question and it's probably got a $1 million answer. Look at COPOLCO, the ISO's Consumer Policy Committee, and see what that has to say and offer. It's got some very useful ideas on how to get people involved. It's not easy, and the main reason it's not easy is that consumers are outsiders in any committee that is setting up a standard. You don't have any help, you don't have any support, and very often you have hostility. I've been told that I was not necessary on a standard because the regulator did the job of looking after the consumers. That was by an Australian regulator. Was also told at one point that I was the most hated woman in Western Australia for insisting on a switch off for cookers so that you could turn the thing off at the wall rather than have it catch fire. It's not an easy task at all. And so you need to, I guess, find a way of training people up and supporting them, mentoring them, and making sure that they don't go to one meeting, fall off their chair and never come back. It ain't easy.
Thank you, Patricia. It may not be easy, but it's incredibly important. So thank you very much for your words and helping us to find the place to go to get some of the answers. I'm going to draw the panel discussion to a close now. I'd like us to thank our panel. So Zeeman, Shulk, Carmen, Byron, Patricia, Barbara, thank you so much for your input. I think that's certainly brought up a whole bunch of topics. I've got some down the side that I'm going to capture around effectiveness and access. I think that's an important discussion. Context, consumer input. I think these are all subjects to bring a little bit further into this discussion. I'm going to ask you if you could possibly return to your spaces, and I'm going to invite Greg up now. So Greg Preston is